Hi, this is Brian Kim. I'm going to share with you case number 189 in the best way to do cataract surgery series. This is a 2+ dense lens, and you're going to see posterior synechiae and synechiolisis. And then this is a really tiny pupil, really small pupil. But you're going to see double chop, cross chop, and mechanical fracturing techniques, crushing the lens with the instruments, hooking the lens from the periphery to pop it into the central safe zone, into pupillary center, carefully and methodically fracturing the lens into smaller pieces, emulsifying the lens piece. This provides exquisite control and confidence with lens disassembly. So this is a case, you can see this pupil is quite small and there's some posterior synechiae to the left side of the screen. I used a corneal marker which will help me to center and size a rhexis, and I turn the eye with the cotton tip, make my paracentesis on the right side, and then the left side, making sure I'm parallel to iris plane, which creates a nice corneal shelf, which will allow me to achieve a self-sealing incision. This is intracameral epinephrine, and this is some dispersive viscoelastic to coat the corneal endothelium and hopefully achieve a little bit of viscodilation as well. And this is a triplanar corneal incision. I make a vertical groove, place the blade into the deep part of the groove, tunnel through the cornea, and then when I'm ready, I enter. I'm using the cannula to control the eye, and then I'm using my rhexis forceps to try to tease off any more fibrotic membranes on the posterior synechiae here. But with the teeth closed, I'm very ginger, turning the teeth sideways so I don't puncture the anterior capsule. I'm just trying to remove any potential adhesions. And then I'm using the viscoelastic cannula to viscodilate the pupil away from the anterior capsule edge. So you can see there's some fibrotic material on that left side, and I'm just using the rhexis forceps to lift up the iris off the anterior capsule. Push some more viscoelastic in, and then this is again the puncture style rhexis using the sharp tip Hydrodissection. I puncture the center, but the tear goes towards the left. That's no problem. With the teeth closed, I basically create almost like a cystotome where I'm able to tease and redirect the tear, grabbing the right side of the tear, going around circumferentially. Of course, this is a small pupil, and so I'm just trying to make the rhexis just a little bit larger than the pupillary size and diameter. The good news about these situations is very unlikely that you're going to get a radialization of your rhexis when you have a small pupil. Finish off the rhexis, burp some viscoelastic out. And this is the capsular fornix hydrodissection technique. I'm going to place a cannula under the rhexis edge contra-incisionally, making sure I'm into the fornix, point the tip down. Very slowly get a nice wave. You can see the wave occur. Watching the pupil to make sure it doesn't go into the main wound. It's very important, especially if you're worried about IFUS. Decompress, removing the decompress the bag, sweeping underneath the rhexis edge on the left side, freeing up the anterior capsule, using the BSS cannula to mechanically as well as with the BSS hydrodissect. Doing the same thing on the right side and very carefully trying to rotate the lens. Doing a little bit more hydrodissection. Again, pushing down on the lens, trying to squeegee some of that fluid around within the bag, and now the lens begins to spin. There we go. Irrigating the surface of the eye, lifting the incision with a chopper, going in with irrigation off to minimize Descemet's trauma, removing the surface epinuclear material, but being very mindful because it's a small pupil. Placing the chopper underneath the rhexis edge contra-incisionally, being very careful, placing the phaco tip vertically sub-incisionally, bringing the instruments together, and the lens fractures in half. That's double chop, placing the chopper around the right heminucleus, pulling essentially toward the phaco tip, fracturing the lens against the phaco tip. The phaco tip acts like a chopping block. With each of those maneuvers, you saw a sudden loss of resistance, which tells you there was complete fracturing of the lens. So I use that chopper to gently lift that first quadrant up out of the bag and then emulsify it. Rotating the second quadrant in front of me, using some vacuum to grab it. Again, using the chopper to again tease it some more. Lifting it with the chopper, amputating that little fragment, and then emulsifying it. And I knew there was another piece, so I use a chopper to hook that lens piece up, and I'm able to gently bring it up to the central safe zone, away from the pupillary edge, and then emulsify the lens. So that's the first heminucleus. I'm rotating the second heminucleus in front of me, placing the chopper around the lens, placing the phaco tip deep in the bag. It fractures very easily. You saw that sudden loss of resistance. Placing the chopper around the third quadrant, pulling it centrally toward the phaco tip, and then fracturing that piece as well, using some vacuum to lift that fragment up, and then emulsifying the lens piece. Again, I'm only initiating high vacuum and ultrasonic energy pulses of it when I am in the central safe zone, not during lens disassembly, only when I'm emulsifying and removing the lens piece. Turning that fourth quadrant in front of me, placing the chopper around the lens, hooking the peripheral lens, pulling it centrally toward the phaco tip, fracturing the lens against the phaco tip. Crushing the lens into smaller pieces and then emulsifying the lens piece. Using some vacuum to lift that last piece up, crushing the lens between the instruments, and then emulsifying the lens pieces. Again, all the emulsification is within the central safe zone, and it's not during lens disassembly. It's only when I'm removing the pieces. Removing the epinuclear material from anterior to posterior. And now you have a pretty nice clean bag. I'm just using the chopper to check. So I take the chopper out, push BSS in, take the phaco tip out, and I go in with the INA handpiece. Start subincisionally removing the cortical material from anterior to posterior. When you peel from anterior to posterior, you get a cleaner peeling of the cortex off the bag. Again, going after the subincisional area under the right side. And very careful, you don't want to activate vacuum until you're right up against the material you're trying to remove. Otherwise, you might grab the posterior stuff and then you just have a mess. Don't initiate vacuum until you are exactly ready to remove, and in this case, the anterior cortical material. Polishing underneath the rhexis edge with polish mode. Since this pupil is so small, I'm not going to pulse into the subincisional capsule fornix. I switch to the cohesive, and I'm trying to visualize the anterior capsule rhexis edge, which is quite difficult here. So I'm using the cannula to fill the bag, and I go in with a single piece acrylic lens. And then, because I can't visualize it, I'm going to place the Maltzman underneath, making sure I see the rhexis edge, and I do. And then I quickly transition. I still have the Maltzman in my hand. I'm placing the lens underneath the rhexis edge as it's being delivered. And then I'm going to quickly transition to the INA and with the Maltzman, making sure I visualize the lens, making sure it's within the capsular bag, which it is. Getting underneath the lens, rotating and tilting it. And then I just have to make sure that the trailing haptic is also within the bag, which I'm doing right now. And I'm able to see confidently that the trailing haptic is in the bag. And then on the right side here, the leading haptic is in the bag as well. So you always have to check, you just never know. And because I go underneath the lens to remove the viscoelastic that's trapped in the bag, I don't have to worry about the lens suddenly popping up. Some people are so scared to get underneath the lens, but if you do that in this kind of situation, if you just irrigate the viscoelastic from above the lens, what will happen is all that bolus of cohesive viscoelastic that's in the bag will pop out of the bag, and it's going to cause the lens implant to potentially pop out of the bag, including the haptics. And so that's why I think you see some cases of patients, they have cataract surgery a long time ago, and you'll see one haptic in the bag and one not in the bag. And that's really bad technique. There's no reason for that. You should always check visually check the haptic location, and always go underneath the intraocular lens, remove that viscoelastic. Letting that bolus of viscoelastic pop out of the bag and moving the lens in an uncontrolled way makes no sense. You have no control, and why would you encourage that bolus to push your IOL out of the way and out of the bag? Just go underneath the lens and remove it, and you tilt the lens, and it's not going to cause any problems to the zonules or anything like that. Again, surgeons have to overcome this irrational fear. There's no need to be fearful. All of these maneuvers are safe. So once I know the haptics are in the bag, I remove all the viscoelastic, very carefully turn off the irrigation, push BSS into the anterior chamber with a cannula to keep the chamber formed, and also being mindful not to allow any iris to try to prolapse, especially in these small pupil cases. Hydrate the incisions, and that's the end of the case. So again, there's some posterior synechiae. I use a viscoelastic cannula to help release it, but also my capsular rhexis forceps to release it. And then through a small pupil, I was able to perform double chop, cross chop, mechanical fracturing techniques. This is a very controlled way of disassembling the lens. Because using mechanical forces to fracture the lens, it's literally just like using two instruments to just crush a piece of material. It's very controlled. When you're using high vacuum and ultrasonic energy, it is not a controlled situation. You know, it'd be like having a race car and going 100 miles an hour. No matter how good you think you are, if you slip on an oil spill, you can spin out and crash. And so when you have the high fluidics like that, you just don't have that same level of control. But whereas if you have two instruments and you just have irrigation on, everything's in slow motion, everything's well controlled, nothing's happening that's outside of your control whatsoever. I'm able to place the chopper around the lens at the level of the equator, bringing the lens out of the bag, crushing it against the phaco tip. I have extreme control and ability to fracture and disassemble the lens. Again, all just with irrigation, no vacuum, no ultrasonic energy. Fracture the lens at any angle because I'm able to employ cross chop, which I'm able to chop in any different angle within the bag. I'm very versatile, very controlled. I never feel like I'm stuck. I never feel like I can't remove the lens. And that's the power of leveraging mechanical fracturing, but also the power of hooking the lens peripherally with a chopper. And that's why it's so advantageous to have this right angle chopper that's a little bit longer than average. And so I have exquisite control. I'm able to overcome this tiny pupil, which in my mind is not a liability at all. Other people get scared, they get nervous, they think, why don't you put hooks in? Why don't you put a ring in? Well, that's because of their limitation of their own techniques. So of course, if you approach this case with your techniques, yeah, you're going to run into trouble. But if you think about trying to change your technique and improve it, try to stretch yourself like I do, well, you don't have these problems. I do these cases like this all the time. I don't have problems with rupturing the bag. Honestly, I've never ruptured the bag or caused a complication when I've had these small pupil situations. I mean, you know, worst comes to worst, you could have iris prolapse. I mean, that's certainly possible. But other than that, a catastrophic complication or anything like that, because of poor visualization, is really not something I've ever had an issue with. And that's because I know where the instruments are in my hands. I know where I am within the capsular bag. And with that, you have tremendous confidence to be able to overcome a small pupil with a 2+ dense lens. So I hope this was helpful to you, and I thank you for your attention.